Some of the companies are going to have a lot of trouble, and most of them aren't going to make it through this process. So they need a whole new certification, and not just certification for safety of the airplane. They have to certify the production system in order to produce vehicles to fly passengers.
Joby Aviation has been around for 10 plus years. And even if we do see, frontline innovations which may improve battery design, it seems like it's difficult to replace something because it would reset that certification timeline. Am I understanding that correctly?
If you were to look at like what eHang has right now, for example, do you believe, technologically speaking, they're ahead?
Well, I mean, that opens up a lot. A lot of elements to this. Governmental support of business operations, and clearly the Chinese are doing it in this area. The FAA announced a special program, and the idea, I believe, is looks like to accelerate the certification of these airplanes. So there's 8 different teams, kind of including the Electra company that I was doing some consulting for, and Archer, and Beta, and Joby, and all the kinds of U.S. players. Right?
You could kind of map out the major bottlenecks to bringing an eVTOL to the commercial stage.
The batteries are an issue because basically using today's batteries, they have no range. What people are finding out is when you apply the batteries in a realistic system, you could either take out passengers and payload and replace them with battery weight. You can do a longer mission, or you can go a hybrid approach. By the time you account for those other factors, you're only getting maybe 200 watt-hours per kilogram out.
If we do go to these higher specific energy batteries, do we have any trade-offs from that perspective?
Yeah, there's a lot of trade-offs.
Fair enough.
And that's kind of, they also were looking at doing short takeoff and landing instead of vertical takeoff. It's a fantastic technology. They use all those electric motors essentially to trick the wing into thinking it's traveling at high speed and generating a lot of lift when you're actually going 30 miles an hour. What we really need is to get back to that 400 level or something. So if we had 500 or 600 and then we took our knockdown factors, we'd be 350 or in that range, and that would do it, I think.
Where would you say that you are? Are you optimistic about this, the battery technology?
No, I would say I put my effort into.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Vedant. This is my co-host Nathan, and this is the first episode of the Geek Podcast. We're here to explore technological niches that we find really interesting. A lot of these will have barriers to entry, just to understand the technology. And our first topic is autonomous aviation. We're joined here by Professor Bradley, Dr. Bradley. I don't know. We both can work, but why don't we just start by getting you to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, let's see. I'm Marty Bradley. I teach the aircraft design class at USC for the aerospace engineers in the Aerospace and Mechanical Engineering department. I also taught a class in sustainable aviation in the fall, and that includes topics including electric aircraft and electric vertical takeoff aircraft and things like that. What else? I retired from Boeing in 2020, but I started teaching at USC before that. I worked in the advanced concepts group at Boeing, where we looked at all kinds of different unusual technologies, advanced technologies, including the advanced air mobility and electric aircraft and air taxis and those kinds of things. But since I retired, I've been consulting for companies that are actively working in that area. I consulted for Amp Air, who's doing electric aircraft. I'm currently working with Electra, who is doing a short takeoff and landing hybrid electric aircraft. I've been involved in the AIAA, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. They have a working group and now a technical committee on electric aircraft. I'm a member of the Vertical Flight Society. So I'm pretty well tied into all these things. I've spent more time working on the advanced air mobility kinds of things since I retired from Boeing than when I was at Boeing, because a lot of my time at Boeing was focused on commercial airliners and things like that. Since then, I retired, I've worked a lot more in the various advanced air mobility areas.
Beautiful. Could you explain the concept of advanced air mobility or AAM? Like, what are the end state, or what are the goals like?
Well, I think it's kind of a varied topic. There's a lot of different players, and each one may have a slightly different answer kind of to that question. But I think the whole idea is to change by adding an element to the way we do transportation around the United States and around the world. The ability to use advanced air mobility to do things like if you wanted to quickly go from LAX to downtown Los Angeles, you could potentially fly over the traffic and things like that. That's one element of it. Others would be, you might want to come in from the southern part of Orange County and fly into USC to teach a class. I get stuck on the freeway a lot of times. I'm in the northern part of Orange County, but still it can take me an hour to get to or from USC. Maybe there's other possibilities. Other things would be like coming in from, if you're out in the Palmdale area working on an aerospace project and you want to come back into the LA basin, right? That's a heck of a commute as well, 90 minutes plus in your car potentially. those kinds of things you might be able to do with some kind of advanced air mobility. Many of the people working in the area are looking at vertical takeoff aircraft that would be able to take off from parking lots and rooftops and things like that, rather than having to go from airport to airport. And while other players in advanced air mobility, like the electric company that I consult for, they're looking at 150-foot kind of landing and takeoff areas, which would not be airports either, but you would take off from things like that. So can we add another dimension to the regional transportation is really what it's all about.
I think that's honestly a perfect segue to kind of the next question, which is kind of like, could you explain what eVTOL aircrafts are and maybe how we would differentiate them from eCTOL aircrafts? Kind of, maybe some color on what's the range that we're looking at, because, of course, different aircraft designs might lend for longer distances. You brought up some examples there. So what are eVTOL aircrafts? How do they differ from what we know today?
Right. So we throw around the term, but let's define it, right? The E is usually a small e. It's put in front of VTOL. So E stands for electric. It could be a hybrid electric. Usually, started out mostly fully electric, battery-powered vehicles, but it's evolved into hybrid electric. And then the VTOL is vertical takeoff and landing. So that means you're essentially taking off from something that looks like a heliport. You're just going up, you're taking your mission, you're coming back down. Very minimal kind of footprint on the ground. The eCTOL is electric conventional takeoff and landing. That airplane would require a runway, but it would be an electric aircraft. You would plug it in. It would be either fully electric or hybrid electric, and you would fly efficiently and maybe at low cost and maybe with no emissions. So it might be environmentally better. If you charged your batteries with good electricity, you could essentially do those hops around the LA area that I mentioned without any emissions. And so that would be the advantage. And then in between those is the STOL, short takeoff and landing. So electric short takeoff and landing is an airplane that would take off in 150 feet and could take off from not an airport, but it could take off from a prepared parking lot kind of thing. So those are the three, bits of alphabet soup that typically get applied. Some people call the electric VTOL also air taxis because they tend to have that role, kind of the way I described, moving around the area kinds of thing.
I'll ask a quick follow-up to that, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail later when we talk about some of the bottlenecks and some of the trade-offs that come with trying to bring these to market. But I'm curious, within these models, eVTOL, eCTOL, and kind of this mid-range, is there a certain like one or two of these that might be more like closer to certification, closer to commercialization just by nature of the design? Really what I'm asking is, how feasible are these if you had to kind of rank them?
Yeah, okay, good question. And that is the heart of, I think, what we're gonna be talking about in terms of bottlenecks, right? They're kind of coming up later. If you're doing an eCTOL aircraft, a lot of people are doing essentially just modifications of an existing airplane. They're adding an electric power system and batteries to that airplane. So that's a supplemental type certification. That seems to be like one of the easiest things that you could do. And so there's some companies looking at that. There are others that have the vertical takeoff airplanes have to be the eVTOLs, right? They have to be new. They're kind of a new kind of configuration to put together. And they have, it's not like there aren't a lot of people out there trying to electrify helicopters themselves, although there are a few that have looked at that. But generally, these are new airplanes. So they need a whole new certification, and not just certification for safety of the airplane. They have to certify their production system in order to produce vehicles to fly passengers in. And so and the FAA in the US and their counterparts in other parts of the world are very involved with that. What else? The eSTOL airplanes are sort of in between. It's a new airplane, but they want to certify it the same way that conventional airplanes are certified. So each one of the, they like to think that they're going to be, relatively easy to certify, and they need to get certified in order to make their businesses work. So maybe follow-up question is going to take me in that direction, I would guess.
I think you briefly mentioned how it's like the eVTOL in particular it's like a whole new class of aircraft, which is why like this whole certification process is like super unknown and like it's going to take a long time. Are these eVTOLs like, I guess, are they just prototypes, or in your opinion, I guess, production ready eVTOLs out there? Like what's the state of the technology, do you think?
The ability to get a clearance from the FAA to do a flight experimental vehicle is much easier than to get a certification from the FAA to fly passengers and make money. You can do an experimental certificate, essentially, and that basically says if you crash, you probably aren't going to hurt people on the ground. But the FAA is not saying your airplane is necessarily safe to fly a lot of people in. The bar for commercial operations flying people that are paid, that pay is much higher. And so that's where the difficulty comes in. That's where people are really having a hard time. You do see a lot of people flying their prototypes around. These are technology demonstration kinds of things. And it's kind of a necessary step along the way, but a lot more, is happening. And some of the companies are going to have a lot of trouble, and most of them aren't going to make it through this process. And kind of what I see is everybody's waiting almost for the first one or two to get certified, and they haven't. And they've been waiting, and they've been in this state of, close to certification for a couple of years. Probably a handful of these companies are fairly close to that. They worked with the FAA for several years. They have a plan given to the FAA. They're waiting for the FAA to come back and basically say, we approve your plan, and here's our data, and okay, now we're going to give you a certificate you can fly. That's where a lot of companies are at the moment. And that's kind of a tough spot to be, because they have employees, they have payroll, they have expenses, and they're churning and spending money, but they're not making any. There's no money coming in. And that's going to make multiple companies fail. In the next couple of years, there'll be a lot of them that fail. But there'll be, if the certification starts on one or two, they also can kind of, see what was successful for the company A. And if they get certified, then company B can say, because a lot of the planning documents are public domain. You can kind of see what the other company did to get certified. And then maybe several of them get certified relatively quickly.
I have a quick follow-up to that before we get into bottlenecks, which I'm really anxious to get to because it'll help contextualize some of the questions that we'll ask later on. But one of the things that I've learned from talking to some people in the industry is that given like how difficult it is to get certain parts certified, and you can definitely speak to, for example, like the battery architecture or even just like the design of the aircraft, it appears that it's pretty difficult to kind of make changes or monumental changes to the fundamental design. As an example of this, I think, Joby Aviation has been around for 10 plus years. And even if we do see, frontline innovations, which may improve battery design and kind of like fundamental aircraft design, it seems like it's difficult to, go and replace something because it would reset that certification timeline. Am I understanding that correctly? And is that kind of a barrier to seeing the optimal frontline frontier eVTOL get commercialized?
Typically, commercial airplanes get certified and they don't change much of anything on them. And sometimes you end up running very old computers and very old components and software because they've been fully approved and certified, and it costs a lot of money to certify something. So you have to go into a kind of a supplemental certification process that is pretty extensive historically. One of the things that I think we identified as we were starting to do these designs was the desire to do something like build in the ability to improve and change the battery technology after the overall system is certified originally, right? And we hope to get there. And then you'd come in, you'd say, okay, 5 years later, 4 years later, 3 years later, we have a new battery technology that will give us double the range. We want to get that in. That's an unusual thing to happen, but it could happen, but it's not very smooth or streamlined. It'd be nice if you could certify the battery separately from the vehicle and then have it a modular kind of plug the new battery in. That's a desire, but I haven't seen that really happening yet. But that would be something that would be very helpful to getting the technology in faster, because you would anticipate some of these things are going to improve.
Yeah, because like we see like eHang in China, they already have a full program or a full commercial program running that's also like fully autonomous as well. So it's kind of, it almost seems like, the regulation might be like one of the hardest hurdles, even like setting technology aside. If you were to look at like what eHang has right now, for example, is that difference in like why they're so far ahead? Do you believe technologically speaking, they're ahead, or is just because, I guess like regulation wise, Chinese government is a lot easier to certify these things than in America?
Well, that opens up a lot, a lot of elements to this. Yes. Practice in flying and getting a certification from a friendly government, right, that may be supportive of these vehicles, like has happened for eHang. They may be they're doing better than other companies that are still waiting, right, in Europe and the United States or other Asia, maybe other parts of Asia. They're waiting to get up and to get to that point. Ultimately, whether that would give them an advantage or not is kind of hard to say, but it is worth bringing up some of the governmental, I would even say political or business support, governmental support of business operations. And clearly the Chinese are doing it in this area. They like to promote the electric vehicles. They certainly like to promote the idea of their battery technology and things like that. And so this fits into that. In the United States, the FAA has a much longer history. And safety is paramount to everything they do. They had problems with safety with, 787 and the 737 MAX. And so they kind of went a little, the pendulum kind of swung a little more toward we have to be super safe. That may be kind of slowing them down a little bit. But I mean, just yesterday, I was looking this up, the FAA announced a special program.
That's right.
An electric aircraft pilot program, and they selected, it turns out, 8 different proposals. And the idea, I believe, is it looks like to accelerate the certification of these
Oh, wow.
airplanes. So there's 8 different teams kind of, that you would be used to, including the electric company that I was, doing some consulting for, and Archer and Beta and Joby and all the kinds of US players, right, that you would expect. And I think there's an interest in the competitiveness of this and really encouraging the FAA to give some quicker approval in these areas. So this is like a precursor step maybe to getting those kinds of approvals. And, that's maybe an important step in kind of getting this kickstarted in the United States, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. As I understand it, I think, I also saw the press release for that yesterday. It seemed pretty interesting. I also know that some of these companies that were selected are going to begin testing in Dubai, I believe, for some of their early test flights. And, to your point about how different governments are going to have different kind of perspectives on safety and protocols, it seems like the UAE has always been, I guess, more on the frontier of innovation, I guess, or chooses to be. And perhaps that's kind of an incentive to start there. And maybe this program brings some of that testing to the United States quicker than we expect. I am going to transition here because I think some of the things we've been talking about fit under the broader category of kind of major bottlenecks and issues. And I do expect that we might end up focusing a good bit on the battery. But I am curious if you could kind of map out the major bottlenecks to bringing an eVTOL to the commercial stage, and perhaps also for, seeing the type of scale that we would need for that, that what you could visualize, that reality of kind of air taxis on the sky. And that might be a little bit in the future. But yeah, what are kind of the major bottlenecks right now?
Well, I mean, we talked about the certification as a bottleneck, but let me move away from that a little bit because that clearly is still, I think that's still important. The technological issues, the batteries are an issue because what people are finding out is when you apply the batteries in a realistic system, and the idea that you can't drain every battery from 100% down to 0 every time you use it. I think we get used to that maybe with some of our phones and our electric cars. We start learning about this and all that. You basically need to only use a portion of the battery to keep its life. So, you typically are using less than 80% of the total battery charge each time. You'll save the rest of it. So that plus the realities of hooking all the system together and adding things like you probably want to put temperature sensors in them to make sure they don't, the temperature is good. You may need to cool the batteries if they get too hot. These various things, and maybe optimism on how good batteries were going to be in this time frame, has led to most of these vertical takeoff and landing, the eVTOL airplanes. Basically, using today's batteries, they have no range. They basically can take off, and they get up some altitude, and then they have to come back down, and they don't have any energy left to do the mission they need to do, or they have very short range or very reduced payload. So what has happened is you've seen, so I mean, that vehicle that I described might not even be able to make it from LAX to the USC, for example, right? So it's not useful. So you need more range. You could either take out passengers and payload and replace them with battery weight. You could do a longer mission, or you can go a hybrid approach. So you go hybrid electric and you put a generator that burns some fuel on board. And most of the organizations have a hybrid electric version many of them are transitioning from their fully electric version to a hybrid electric version, which gives you potentially, you can extend your range by a little bit or a lot, but you're giving up the cleanliness, the low emission, having fully electric, and you're burning jet fuel, or you're burning something like that. And so you lose a little bit of that advantage, and it makes the system more complex because now you have not only electric motors, but you also have fuel burning engine, and there's cost involved. But that gives you the range that you want. That's another thing that's happening with batteries. The new batteries they need to be better than the generation of batteries that's currently available to make those vehicles have a really good range that would be effective in a business sense. If nobody wants to take an air taxi to go 5 miles when you could jump in an autonomous electric car and do the same thing faster.
This battery issue, is this, in your opinion, like the central issue when it comes to eVTOLs being commercially viable? I mean, is there, I guess, other aspects of the eVTOL currently, or the different kinds of eVTOLs that, are not yet up to standards in your opinion? Or would you say like the fact that the battery is just, there's not enough range, or the battery's too heavy, like this is the main issue from getting into commercial hands?
I think it's the biggest technical issue. I think it can be overcome by going to hybrid electric with increased complexity. So, I mean, it messes up the original vision of having just electric vehicles flying, but it can still be viable. I think if you go with the hybrid electric approach, or, if the batteries can get twice as good, which there's some battery people that will tell you that's coming very soon. That's maybe what we thought, but history is showing that it's taking longer. So that might stretch the timeline out.
Could I actually just follow up real quick?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned some battery people think it's kind of coming soon. Do you think you could be a bit more specific about what that looks like? Because we read through a bit of your research, and on our own, we found out about the Sabres program at NASA, and they have a prototype that I think has, a specific energy of around 500 watt hours per kilogram, but it doesn't.
That would be great.
Right. What would be the minimum, I guess, viable specific energy? I know that's really not necessarily something you can define. What would be the minimum specific energy, kind of theoretical energy for, an eVTOL to be, capable of going the distances that you talk about? Because I think there's so many options, and you mentioned this like hybrid electric setup, and I wonder, where does that specificity come in? Because it's all kind of on a spectrum.
Yeah. I guess we did some studies I did early on, and it's something like 400 watt hours per kilogram specific energy would be good. What we found though is that we had to take knockdown factors for battery life, and we had to be concerned about whether the battery temperature was controlled, and the batteries lose a little bit of energy efficiency over their lifetime. And by the time you account for and you have to have reserves. By the time you account for those other factors, you're only getting maybe 200 watt hours per kilogram out or less. And if you go buy a battery today, you're probably going to get 250, and then you're going to lose half of it, and you'll be down into the 100, 150 range, and you won't get any range at all. But the newest batteries might be close to 400, and you're able to get 200 effective out of it. What we really need is to get back to that 400 level or something. So if we had 500 or 600, and then we took our knockdown factors, we'd be 350 or, in that range, and that would do it. I think that would give us the range, the capability that we're looking.
Could I ask, like, if you have a hybrid model, what does the specific energy look like in those cases? I presume that it's magnitudes higher. Is that correct?
Well, no, but you're getting a lot of the energy from fuel, which has a much order of magnitude higher specific energy. What you end up with is a much smaller battery, which you still want to be high specific energy, but you don't need a big battery anymore because you're getting the majority of your electrical power is coming from the generator. So it changes the balance, right? It doesn't make the weight of the battery as important as it does if you're just flying on battery.
Is there a trade-off, with some of these like frontier battery chemistries in terms of cycle life, for example, or, for example, like discharge and recharge cycles? Because I know there's some of these nuances where cycle life is extremely important for the economics. And so I'm kind of curious, if we do go to these higher specific energy batteries, do we have any trade-offs from that perspective?
Yeah, there's a lot of trade-offs.
Fair enough.
And that's kind of the issue, is that you can get a battery that will give you high specific energy, or you can get a battery that will supply lots of power, or you can get a battery that will have lots of life. And what we really need is a battery that will do all those things. And typically you can get maybe one or two of those, but you can't get all of them. And then you throw in battery cost. So it is a very much a trade-off between battery, the characteristics of different battery chemistries. There are chemistries theoretically that will go, to 1,000 watt hours per kilogram or even higher, but the practical limits are much lower, and they're not yet fully determined what they're going to be. And we do need life along with power and energy.
If you had to make a bet on which frontier battery chemistry seems most viable, where would you place your bet?
I think it's too open to know. I don't think I would put a bet. Yeah. I mean, the chemistries, there's lithium sulfur chemistries, there's solid state batteries that have chemistry, there's lithium air batteries that there's all these. I don't know who the winner's going to be.
It's sort of fascinating, right? You can be 10 to 15 years into development for, with quite a lot of investment behind it, and still have such unknowns. But I guess that's kind of what makes the area so exciting, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think they thought they'd have the batteries they needed with, I don't know, the most advanced lithium ion batteries. They thought maybe that would be enough. I don't think it is because of the factors that we discussed. So they need to go to a next generation chemistry. And some people are very optimistic and some people are very conservative in forecasting where we're going to be. So
Where would you say that
pretty much
that you are? Are you optimistic about this, the battery technology?
I would say I put my effort into trying to understand how to make a hybrid electric system work.
So yeah, let me just jump on that real quick. Could you talk a little bit about what Electra's working on? I think my friend actually, I had a little chat with him and he showed me the design for the aircraft, and I believe it has 8 propellers. Is that correct? I could be wrong. Distributed on the wings. I might have been looking.
Right.
Yeah.
I went to work helping Electra out when I first retired from Boeing. It was kind of my first thing I wanted to do. And I liked the idea that they already had figured out, as I did, that the people doing pure battery stuff were going to have a hard time. And so the hybrid approach was something to look at. They also were looking at doing short takeoff and landing instead of vertical takeoff. So they don't need nearly as much power and energy to take off and land as a vertical takeoff airplane did. So they were looking at that technology, which is it's a fantastic technology. They use all those electric motors essentially to trick the wing into thinking it's traveling at high speed and generating a lot of lift when you're actually going 30 miles an hour kind of thing. And also they were focusing on relatively short range. They weren't trying to do thousands of miles of range and carry replace airliners. They're trying to do it. So all the things they're working on seem to have the best chance of success. And I still kind of think that. But it doesn't mean they'll be the only people that can get through it. And even they could be stopped by certification issues or other things could come up. But I still feel that an approach like that has the best chance of being successful. And the approach of, if you stuck with doing vertical takeoff, only batteries, I think that's the toughest one to do.
When you say short runway, like how short are we talking here? Like, can it fit on a rooftop, for example, or does it have to be like, a larger parking structure?
No, I mean like 150 feet of rolling.
Okay.
So you might want 300 feet to have to have some room, safety, those kinds of things. Soccer field size, which is lots of room, lots of places like that if you wanted to establish them. Rooftops, parking structures, parking lots, things like that. Yeah. So but you also have to get approval to build such a facility. You can't just land anywhere. You need to have a safe area. It has to be marked off. It has to be segregated.
Right.
You can't have cars driving in the middle of your landing strip.
Yeah.
So there's still some things to work out. A couple other things that we may or may not, I don't know if we have time to talk about, but another aspect, I'm going to just throw it in so we'll note that it's there, is the concept of once you start doing these, what does the air traffic management look like? That's another issue that could slow this thing down. If you've just got, one company flying some airplanes kind of back and forth with just a few of them in the air, you can kind of handle them like, they handle helicopters now, and air traffic management assigns certain zones. And if they fly into a controlled area, they can talk to air traffic controllers. But you can't do that if you really have this vision for advanced air mobility where you have hundreds of these things flying around. So there's development in how you manage them and do the air traffic stuff. And so that's a consideration also. One of the things they talk about doing is doing a special event like the Olympics. They want to have this going. They might work out something where they've got a scheme where they allow this to happen. They tried to do it for the Paris Olympics 2 years ago, and they weren't good. They weren't far enough along. So the air traffic is part of it. And you mentioned autonomy sometimes. That's also a factor. If you have a vehicle that carries 3 people, there's 4 seats. Do you want to make one of those seats be a pilot? You have to pay. If it was autonomous, you could book an extra passenger and make more money, as well as maybe the autonomy is needed to manage all those vehicles that are flying in the sky. So autonomy is part of it. You can do it without the autonomy, but the economics gets better if you don't have to carry the extra expense and lose the weight and seat of a pilot. So those are other things besides batteries that are also important technologically and could affect the whole industry going forward.
Okay, could I just say real quick? I mean, like, if we were in that scenario where you just see like hundreds of just eVTOLs, I mean, that would be so sick. that would be like, but anyways, like, I mean, when you were talking about autonomy, right? You said that would be a huge thing, like the air traffic control. I mean, I'm just sort of like comparing to like Waymo right now and sort of what Waymo is doing. I mean, if it was introduced as, okay, we're going to be completely pilotless all the time, wouldn't that like get rid of the need for like that air traffic control being an issue? I would assume that they would all sort of be communicating with each other in a certain way, even if it's with different companies, right?
Yeah, potentially. But they have a historical air traffic management network, right? So you got people in there, 7:30 on the approach to LAX talking to flight controller, right? And that system is not set up for autonomous operation. Maybe it could be.
Right.
That's a whole other issue. But you could make everything. You could make everything automated. You could eliminate a lot of the air traffic conversations over the radio. You could do many of those things. The approach that I've seen them take is like establish a corridor where the air taxis would fly. So you establish a corridor between an air taxi terminal at LAX to another terminal that's in downtown Los Angeles, for example. And you basically designate all traffic in this corridor defined by north and south and also altitude, right? And then all these air taxis would fly within that. And it might be big or it might be small. They would all be responsible for their own communication, like you said, and avoidance of collision. All that kind of stuff would happen. And so that's the first thing that would get set up. Beyond, once you needed to be able to do more than you could handle with the current network, you would establish certain corridors where you would fly these, and you would want to keep other traffic out. So that's the first concept. I think they have different levels. They've established that, and the last level would be everything flies autonomously through and automatically avoids collisions, and the air traffic people just kind of monitor what's going on. That's kind of the last level. So somewhere in between. So that's a consideration. Like I said, it's not important if you got 1 to 5 aircraft flying around, but if you got hundreds, it's a big deal.
Totally makes sense. With the caution of time as well, I do want to ask, I guess, one question, which is if you had to put, because we've pretty much introduced a multitude of different models, right? So we have a manned aircraft, we have unmanned, we have a hybrid, we have an electric only, and then even within those categories, we have different strategies. If we were to map, eVTOL versus eCTOL versus, let's say, hybrid and then autonomous, which I assume is way down the line, what do you think that people should be focusing on more short term versus more long term?
Well, autonomy could kind of plug in at any point to any of these. I mean, the first ones that should be getting certified would be the electric conventional takeoff and landing airplanes. And there actually are a couple that have some kind of various approvals used for things like training, where you're just doing really short flights around an airport. There's a Pipistrel airplane in Europe is approved, and there's some approval in a limited way in the US to do some of that kind of thing. But can they make money carry passengers only very, very short ranges? So that's going to be limited. But that one should get something like that should get certified first. The short takeoff stuff that Electra is doing, that should get it approved fairly soon, I would think. The eVTOL people have been flying. I've been putting on flights. Somebody should get certified, at least for short range. I mean, the FAA should not care whether the vehicle can only go a short range or not. The people that want to make money care, but in terms of getting something certified to fly a short distance, it seems like it's all right on the verge of getting certified. And I think it's almost like it's a dam that if the dam breaks, then a whole bunch of certifications going to happen fast. The other thing is political will to make it happen. I mean, we have an administration now. It's very pro-business, and they may just say do it. Other previous administrations would have been more careful and cautious and rely on expert regulator experience. I mean, you could just get an edict that you need to make this happen for the Olympics. So, right. And then they would make it happen. That could break it open and make it flow to make the industry flow to something more.
Yeah.
So
seems like rather than waiting on some huge technological breakthrough and it's just an idea right now, but all that tech right now, works well enough. We just needed to want it to happen, I guess, for that regulation to go through.
That gets it started, but doesn't ensure success in the long term. Another thing I didn't mention: public acceptance of all these vehicles flying over their head.
Yeah.
How noisy are they? Are people going to be bothered and not want to have a vertiport with these things anywhere near them? People get nervous of package delivery in their neighborhood, things like that. Then there are risks of things like a series of accidents where people are killed and injured, and people lose faith in the safety of such a system. So those are risks that could also affect the industry.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor, I do want to wrap up, but I do want to ask you one last question, which is maybe a little bit broad here, but what got you excited about aerospace when you originally joined the industry, and why are you still excited? Like, what gets you excited now?
I mean, when I was a kid growing up, right, I was always building things, and science fiction was great, and
Yeah.
I was building spaceships and rockets, and then I had not just science fiction, I had science facts because it was essentially they put a man on the moon, right? They built moon rockets, they did all that stuff. That's what was happening when I was a kid growing up. So that's what I played. I played rocket scientist, and it just was so natural, right? It just kind of went. The other thing, honestly, was also a Cold War influence because the US was in a technological race with the Soviet Union, and the idea that aerospace could get us ahead and keep us safer and save people's lives and do autonomous things instead of having to put people at risk and all that. Those kinds of things were just strong when I was growing up and when I was starting my career. I ended up eventually transitioning to things that completely peaceful in terms of saving the environment and doing different things. But there was just a series of things that just made aerospace the most exciting thing to be working in. For somebody that was technically minded, engineering mindset, all that kind of stuff, it was a great place to be working.
It's pretty
Nice.
beautiful. I think everyone we've talked to so far had some element of loving to build when they were growing up, and well, actually, really regardless of the era, just some like fascination with getting things in the sky. So no proper way to wrap it up here, but I will say really do appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Joining us today. And I don't know, I think we had a lot of important questions answered. I think especially on the battery front, there's just, I mean, it's cool to get some clarity, but it also seems like it's wide open.
It is. The difference between the claims that people make and reality is big.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And it seems like there's also a need to really publicize a lot of this research because it's an incremental gain kind of industry, right? Where you need to raise capital funding at like the right increments to keep your company alive. So it totally makes sense too that companies might be incentivized to publicize advancements as they come through, even without full validation. I understand that, but I think conversations like this are also really good to help kind of separate what you see from what is realistic.
Well, I mean, people come asking for money, right?
Yeah.
Please
Right.
give us money to invest in our battery technology. And there's a long string of them. It is hard if you're not an expert in battery technology to know who's credible and who's not. So the use of some technical expertise to bring into your investment decision, I think, is kind of important. And if you're doing batteries, you would actually want to talk to me. Maybe talk to me first. But if you'd want to talk to somebody that knew the battery technology area in a very strong way. Yeah, to make investments based on pitches that somebody's making to you if you don't have the technical expertise on your team is very dangerous.
That's what you'll see a lot of venture capital firms will hire people that are directly very focused on battery, maybe even in an academic context, because I mean, otherwise, what are you filtering for, right? So
Yeah. They're gonna say whatever, but then, like you said, it's just like it's completely different from the reality of the situation, right?
I mean, and the other difference is you can do it in a lab, but to deliver it in a cell that can be reused, put into a battery pack, it makes a difference because you can do almost anything in the lab and get real results, right? But have you made it into a battery that can be used and reused and put into a big pack with a lot of other batteries? That's another step. It costs a lot more money. That's why they want more money, so they can take to that step.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Money has to precede also the proof of concept in many cases.
You guys are not aerospace engineers, right? So you're not going to take my class.
Well,
it's our last semester as well.
Yeah, it is our last semester. That's true. Well, think about it more this way. I'd actually really like to keep in touch because this is research that we're probably going to be doing for quite a long time, and I'm sure we'll pepper you with questions, even if we don't have the privilege of being in your class. So
yeah, I mean that's what you find out when you're working on aircraft, aerospace, as well as sustainability topics. Is it's way more than engineering.
Yeah,
right. There's money, there's politics, there's a lot of other stuff going on. It's not just the engineering. So
yeah,
understanding that. Okay, very good.
Well, thank you, Professor.
All right, have a good
Thank
day.
you.
You have a great day. Thank you.